to the Center for Brooklyn History. My name is Marcia Eli. I direct all the programs here at the center. I have the pleasure of saying a few words of greeting on behalf of all of my colleagues here at the Center for Brooklyn History and my colleagues at the Brooklyn Public Library, which we are a part of, and the Arts and Culture team, BPL Presents. Tonight we're honored to welcome John Cassidy, whose new book, Capitalism and Its Critics, A History from the Industrial Revolution to AI, traces 200 years of global capitalism through the voices of its most insightful and influential critics. The book has been praised by Nobel Prize winner in economics Joseph Stiglitz as, quote, everything we've come to expect from John Cassidy, an engaging and trenchant discussion, an essential read. John's conversation partner tonight is journalist and broadcaster Doug Henwood, and you'll hear more about both of them in just a moment. First, I want to share that Capitalism and Its Critics is available at the CBH shop, which is in the corner over there. Some of you found it already and got your copies. John will happily sign copies following the talk in the front of the room that you entered. I also want to share that at the end of their discussion, we'll turn to you and your questions. Our ushers will bring a mic to you at your seat. I only ask that you please keep your questions brief and please stand while you're speaking. And try to not have lengthy commentary, please. So now let me tell you a bit more about tonight's guests. John Cassidy is a staff writer at The New Yorker and the author of Con, The Greatest Story Ever Sold, and How Markets Fail, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in nonfiction. He lives in New York City. Doug Henwood is a journalist and broadcaster who specializes in economics and politics. He edited the newsletter Left Business Observer from 1986 to 2013 and has produced a weekly radio show and podcast, Behind the News, since 1995. In addition to authoring 2 books, he's written for Harper's and The Nation and is currently working on a book about the rot of the American ruling class. So, I'm excited to hear this conversation. I know you are too. Please help me welcome John and Doug to the stage.
I guess the MC role falls to me. So welcome to all of you. Thanks for coming. At the outset, I have to say this is a very impressive piece of work, John. I'm very,
thank you.
You did a great job on this. It's very well researched, informative, and also highly readable. And the dismal science has a reputation for being dull. And there's a chapter on Thomas Carlile, coiner of the term the dismal science, in this book, which is well worth reading. So how'd you come to write this, and did you ever imagine it would turn out so large?
Good question. Thanks, everybody, for coming. I really appreciate it. How did I start writing this book? The idea first came to me when Bernie Sanders was running for president in 2016 and Donald Trump was running for president. It seemed to me at that stage that that was more than just a sort of one-off, and that it was a sort of result of a sort of whatever had gone before had reached some sort of an impasse, and there was a story to be written about how did we get into that state. So I initially thought of it as a shorter book. I'm afraid it's pretty long in the end. But I originally thought of it as a book sort of telling the story from the end of the Cold War, but then I thought, oh no, not another book about neoliberalism. There's been so many of them, and some of them are very good, some of them are not. But I thought that's not going to work. And anyway, it came to me as I was sort of started researching that a lot of the topics which come up if you start to address the sort of last 30, 40 years, like globalization, rampant inequality, sort of worker exploitation, monopoly, consumer exploitation, they actually go back to the very beginning of the capitalist system, industrial capitalism. Someone wants to ask me how I define capitalism, happy to answer. But for these purposes, I'm talking about industrial capitalism, which originated really in where I'm from, in northern England, in the late 18th century. So I kept going back, and eventually I thought, you know what the hell, just do the whole kibosh instead of doing bits of it. So that was sort of, okay, that's good. I'm going to write a history of the last 250 years of the world. How do you do that? And that was when I guess the sort of New Yorker side came into me. One thing they do bang into your head at the New Yorker, and I've been there nearly 30 years, is that if you want to tell a story, you better put some people in it. It can't just be a theme, you know, that's an idea. And as somebody who writes about themes, that's always the challenge. How do you sort of, you know, they have a horrible phrase, how do you storyfy it? So how did I storyfy the history of capitalism? I sort of took a leaf out of one of the economists, sort of centre-left economists who I met when I first came to New York 40 years ago now, Bob Heilbronner, who used to teach at the New School, wrote a book which is still in print, which first came out in the 1950s, I think, called The Worldly Philosophers, which is biography-based. And because of that, that's the reason it's still in print, I think. Now, he only covered the sort of, you know, the sort of totem poles, Marx, Keynes, Adam Smith. I thought, you know, I wanted to go a lot broader than that, both geographically and sort of ideologically. So the challenge then was, you know, who do you pick? And this answer's gone on long enough, but I ended up picking about 30 of them, and they're the subjects of each chapter. Some chapters have more than one, most are one individual, and that's the base of the book. I say in the introduction, if there's a conceit about the book, or a conceit the book is based on, it's the idea that you can tell the history of capitalism through the eyes of its critics. That was the sort of idea I had in my head that kept me going in the dark times.
I can imagine somebody from Cato writing Capitalism and Its Cheerleaders in response. The late, great, and insufficiently well-known Marxist sociologist James O'Connor once told me that capitalism has been in crisis since the 13th century, which is one version of his birth date, though you accept the more canonical 18th century. It seems like the 30 glorious years, I won't inflict my French on anyone, the immediate post-World War II decades with their relatively egalitarian distribution of income and wealth and relatively stable cyclical behavior. Well, the older among us thought that was like the new normal, but it turned out to be a brief exception in the history of capitalism. Does this system thrive on crisis? Is it wrong to see crisis as kind of its norm?
Well, I mean, as I say in the introduction, capitalism is always in crisis, recovering from a crisis, or headed to the next crisis. That's been true since the beginning. You know, in the 19th century, the crisis, mostly financial crisis or commodity price collapses, they tended to happen about every 10 years. Because of Keynesianism and monetary policy and fiscal policy now, the crises tend to be more spread out. We didn't have we didn't have a big crisis between the 80s and 2008 when we had a blockbuster crisis. But I don't think it's that the system thrives on crisis. It's that its inner contradictions, to get Marxian about it, lead to crisis. There are certain, their system is built on innovation and the profit motive, and that combination of factors has proven incredibly durable and sort of innovative. I mean, you have to recognize the sort of creative power of capitalism, which Marx did. If you read the Communist Manifesto of 1848. First part of it is a sort of hymn to globalization and the sort of achievements of the bourgeoisie, as he says, who, says have outdone the pyramids. So the early critics of capitalism recognized its incredible sort of productiveness. How could you not? But allied to that are sort of, tendencies to destruct. That obviously, on a long term, it generates class conflict, generates financial crises. Now we find it's always generated pollution and externalities. Terrible economic term. It's always generated pollution and sort of, noxious outpourings of all types. They seem manageable for a long time. Now it turns out, they may be burning the planet. So that in itself is a sort of, maybe an existential threat of capitalism. So yeah, I don't know if it thrives on it, but it's I don't know if it thrives on. Some people say it does thrive on crisis. The next crisis produces the next boom. One of the chapters is on Nikolai Kondratiev, who made that argument, a Russian economist. But it's certainly integral to the system, I would say.
Yeah, I started writing about economics in 1986, and the USSR was still barely alive. Reaganism was in its triumphalist phase. I started doing my radio show in 95. The USSR was dead, and Bill Clinton was consolidating the victory of capitalism. There was no alternative, Thatcher and Fukuyama told us. Things don't seem that solid now. How would you judge the health and popularity of the system today?
Well, I mean, as I said, the book was born of the sort of dual, triple crisis of capitalism, whatever you call it. Adam Tooze calls it the polycrisis. You know, we're at this sort of confluence of events in history which have produced this great populist backlash, globalization, rising inequality, the great neoliberal experiment. Whatever whatever its promise was to begin with, ended up producing an enormous backlash, much as another person who I focus on in the book, Karl Polanyi, the Austrian social theorist, would have predicted. He made the argument back in the 1930s that capitalism and democracy are ultimately incompatible in the long term, and the only two stable outcomes are either fascism on the right, obviously, or state socialism on the left. He supported the latter. But you know, we go to Keynes and the sort of social democratic experiment. That it turns out to be an experiment. When I was growing up and when you were growing up, it seemed that was reality and sort of permanent reality. But that discredited the sort of catastrophists, I think, the 30, 40 years of Keynesian success. It seemed that there was a sort of social bargain. Certainly in Western countries, you could argue that the global South was left out, and it was always sort of exploitative. Some of my critics from Latin America in a chapter on the dependency theories do make that argument. But from our perspective, speaking from the sort of Anglo-Saxon world, we had these 40 years of inclusive, shared growth. And then since then, you know, things have basically gone south. And now we're at the stage where it seems perhaps Polanyi was right after all. You know, we do... The capitalism and democracy seems unstable. We've got the rising authoritarianism on all fronts, and the question is, you know, it's not quite clear what the left-wing option is, but the idea that there'd be this sort of shared prosperity, the system would just reproduce itself generation after generation, I think is now very much under question.
Okay, let's talk about some of the individuals, the characters of the book. Adam Smith, a naive reader might ask, what's he doing here? Isn't he one of the big heroes and celebrants of capitalism? But he did have some issues with the system, so
yeah,
what were they?
I mean, the reason you put Adam Smith in there, two reasons, really. Number one, the book starts in sort of 1770 with a corporate crisis of the British East India Company, which was a monopolistic system at the time. It had a royal monopoly. It was a big corporation with a big headquarters on Leadenhall Street in London, where the City of London is now, board of directors who sent out instructions around the world. It was a multinational corporation, but it predated industrial capitalism. So my first critic, William Boltz, is a whistleblower from the East India Company who, like a sort of big pharma whistleblower or something these days, basically told what was really going on out in India and the other places where the company operated. So I thought that was a great start to the book, because it reminds us that capitalism isn't just industrial capitalism. There was a pre-existing form of capitalism called mercantile capitalism, which was based on colonialism and protectionism. Donald Trump is basically trying to that's his whole agenda is bringing back the 18th century or the 17th century mercantile capitalism, aggressive economic nationalism. There were a lot of wars. Britain and Holland, which were the great trading leaders at the time, were always at war with each other. It was sort of a very violent and protectionist system. Anyway, that started in 1770, but then, of course, 1776, something happens on this side of the pond, of course, but it's also the publication of The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. Now, these days, Adam Smith, as Doug said, is seen as the great apostle of free market capitalism. I used to be a Washington correspondent for my sins for the London Times back in the late 80s and early 90s, And people, all the conservatives in those days used to wear Adam Smith badges. There was an Adam Smith society, and to be a sort of bright young spark in the Republican Party, you had to have your Adam Smith badge on. But Smith himself, if you read The Wealth of Nations, if you read the introduction, he says, I wrote this book as a criticism of mercantile capitalism. So he was actually a critic of the capitalism of his day. He believed protection, he made the same arguments a lot of people in the sort of center ground are now making against Trump, that protectionism was bad, the free market would supply all these goods if we just took down all these tariff walls, and if we sort of unleash the magic of the market, you wouldn't need these abusive monopolies like the East India Company and the Dutch East India Company. So in his own time, he was a critic of capitalism. So that is why he's in the book. And, he also, some of his stuff he said, is very, very contemporary. He said when like 3 or 4 businessmen gather together, it's inevitable that the conversation will eventually turn to how they can conspire to raise prices. So he was no fan of big business. He was a fan of competition. He thought, if you protected competition, that would force businesses to keep prices tied to costs, to innovate, and the system would be, everything would go tickety-boo. So in modern terms, Adam Smith actually would have been a big supporter of Lena Khan.
Okay, and the Luddites, which is often an epithet when you get it from a tech bro, but they had a point, although they were brutally punished and ended up losing very badly. But you have a kind word for these abused people. Why?
Yeah, well, partly it's chauvinism. I'm from Leeds, where some of the Luddites hung out. In fact, when I was a kid, I used to play golf on a municipal golf course called Gotts Park, and I never knew anything about it. That was just the name. Turns out it's named after Benjamin Gott, who was one of the first British industrialists and created the first woolen textile factories in Leeds. Manchester beat us to the punch. By about 20 years, they had the cotton factories, but the wool factories were in Leeds. And the golf course I played on turns out to have been the estate of Benjamin Gott. So Benjamin Gott's, one of the things he did in running his factories was introduce new woolen, sort of mechanical wool shearers. And there were that displaced a lot of, for the time, quite highly paid artisans called croppers. And they were in the vanguard of Ludditism because it was taking away their livelihoods. And there weren't that many of them. The woolen textile industry small than the cotton textile industry. The cotton textile industry was huge. It also displaced the famous handloom weavers. I don't know if any historians in the room, but the story of the handloom weavers is a famous sort of, example of how capitalism, in its sort of creative destruction aspect, basically wiped out a whole industry. And a lot of these people, I quote in the book from the 1830s, some of the accounts of parliamentary commissions going and seeing people actually starving to death, because there was no social welfare in those days. So the Luddites, from their perspective, I title the chapter "The Logic of the Luddites." Now, as I said, for most of the last 200 years, people, to call somebody a Luddite has been a term of abuse. It means you're stupid, you're anti-modernity, you're antediluvian. And in their time, they were some of those things, but it made perfect sense from their point of view. And I think now that we've had a lot, what the Luddites do, they broke into the factories and smashed all the machinery when they could. But there was a very repressive government which started hanging them, and that sort of worked, because the shooting people and hanging them does tend to have a disincentive effect. So the movement didn't last for very long. But I think now, especially with the sort of advent of AI, I think if you worked in the factories in the Midwest, you had sympathy for the Luddites, in the 1980s and 1990s as well. But I think a lot of people in Brooklyn and places are going to start having more sympathy for them in the next few years too, as AI threatens to displace cognitive workers on a huge scale. And it's not just an economic question. Their critique was mainly moral. They wrote letters and they wrote editorials, they petitioned Parliament, and the question was always, what right do the capitalists, the industrialists, have to take away our livelihoods? And that question has always been sort of lurking underneath capitalism, but it's sort of, the justification for the system is obviously in the long term it produces prosperity, and so it's worth the destructive side of it, is offset by the benefits. But when you're at the sharp end of the system, things look different, and the Luddites, I think, were the first to point that out.
Thomas Carlile, an exemplar of reactionary anti-capitalism. Not all anti-capitalism comes from the progressive side. He defended slavery. He had friends in the South. I was reminded of a class I had with Clint Brooks, the old fugitive Southern new critic. It was on Faulkner, and he had a little excursus into the virtues of the slave system as an alternative to Yankee wage labor. Which stuck with me for many, many years since. But what about Carlyle's critique? What is his problem with capitalism?
Carlyle's main problem with capital was a bit like the Luddites. Was from a moral. It was basically a moral argument. He has this phrase. I think he didn't. I'm not sure he came up with the term mammon, which John Ruskin then made famous, but. The critic of it was basically a critic of the profit motive and the sort of unleashed profit motive plus technology he called the shabbiest gospel ever invented, I think. Again, that he saw it as dehumanizing. The early factories were kind of inhuman. They had the majority of the workforce were women and children who, until the Factory Acts of the sort of 1840s, were often working 12, 14-hour days. The phrase Dickensian, that's what it came from. Oliver Twist. So he thought that was morally abhorrent and dehumanizing. Now, as you say, he was not a left. I mean, he was a great supporter of great men. He'd have been a Trump supporter now, probably on the grounds that you need strong men. But he had a sort of moral. He saw himself as a very moral man. He was a Presbyterian, and he had a lot of support actually from the Transcendentalists. That was one of the amazing things which sort of surprised me. Thoreau and people agreed with him because he was a great venerator of nature too, and he was an early sort of critic of the smokestacks despoiling the environment as well, which Ruskin and others took up. So he had various sort of critiques which are now largely asserted with the left, but they came from the right there. And that strand has always sort of lurked under conservatism. There's always been a sort of inherent tension, I think, between sort of Burkean conservatism, which has a bit of that, and then the sort of Adam Smith conservatism where, as long as the free market says it's okay, it's okay.
Okay, I was happy to see Fred Engles got a whole chapter. I don't think he gets enough respect. But let's talk a bit about my man Marx. Now, you obviously take him quite seriously, but you make a lot of how the prophecies of system collapse and the endlessly falling rate of profit, which should be deep in negative territory by now, these never became true. Now, I always read those passages as wish fulfillment, but that may be my Freudian speaking. But in any case, I prefer to focus on his emphasis on exploitation, instability, alienation, and brutality on one hand, and the civilizing progressive aspect of capital on the other hand, and of course contradiction is the motor of history, and how much better we could do with our technical and social resources than what we're doing. Nobody did that kind of critique better. So how much do Marx's failures as a prophet take away from his basic analysis?
Obviously that's a book in itself. You've probably written a book on it, Doug. I don't know. I haven't. I know, well, there are millions of books, but I mean, I've studied Marxist economics as a sort of economic theory and, Schraffian economics. I've done sort of mathematical versions of Marxism. I think the way I would answer your question is what I tried to do in this book with all the thinkers was not rely on the second-hand accounts. If there is a virtue in the book, is that I actually went and read the stuff. I mean, the basic sources, it's very hard to plow through Capital, let's be honest. But I did do it, the first volume. I haven't read all the second and third.
I've never gotten through number 2. 3 is a masterpiece.
Somebody said it's notes, right? I mean, Engles sort of cobbled together a bunch of notes. But on this sort of, obviously, the idea that there was sort of imminent collapse, that didn't work, that hasn't worked out. And the sort of theory of declining rate of profit, some people say that actually wasn't really in the original Marx, that Engles sort of put that together. I don't think that's true. But I think I think the failure, you have to say, why didn't the Marxian prophecies come true? I think my view of Marx is, as a critique of capitalism, and even as an engine for analyzing capitalism, it's actually very useful. I started out as a Keynesian. That was my upbringing in Oxford, in England, and all my tutors, I did economics and history. They were all Keynesians. Some of them were left Keynesians, like Joan Robinson, who's in here, but they were ultimately Keynesians. And they focused on aggregate demand and thought that if you keep that up, things will be generally pretty good. Over the years, I've come to have more of an appreciation for the sort of leftist critiques of exploitation in various forms. But I think if you're looking at Marx as a sort of my critique of Marx, if I critique him, are on two levels. Number one, and it may have just been as a product of his time, what has saved capitalism is that wages have gone up. And wages, until 30 years ago, tracked productivity pretty closely. So you had this immensely productive system, sort of capital-saving labor-saving investments, but somehow the system, as it destroyed all these jobs in the Luddites, it created other jobs. And wages in general, this is obviously not true in some particulars, but wages and living standards went up over the years because the wages tracked productivity. When Marx and Engels were writing in the early Industrial Revolution, that wasn't true. There's something called Engels' pause in the economic history literature. If you look at the wage data from about 1800 to about 1850 in England, there's very little increase in wages, and there's a big increase in profits. That was the world which Marx and Engels grew up in. So that's how they saw capitalism. And if it had stayed like that, it would have collapsed. I think there would have been workers' revolution. They said capitalism creates its own gravediggers, and to some extent they were right. I don't think the system ultimately depends on consent, and I don't think consent would have been given if wages just stayed flat and capitalist profits just went up forever. So what happened? The strength of labor unions, growth of labor unions, which Marx was always a bit iffy about because he thought they weren't revolutionary enough. B, the state. And I don't think Marx and Engels, the original Marxists, had any conception that the state could step in and create social insurance programs, welfare programs, free education, free... I grew up with, free education, free healthcare in the UK. That sort of conception of a sort of European social democracy, and they just couldn't conceive of that. And then in the late 19th century, very late 19th century, when people like Edward Bernstein came along and said, hang on, things are not actually going as was predicted in Capital and the Communist Manifesto. Workers' wages are going up. Various other predictions are not coming true. That produced a sort of crisis in sort of Marxist leftist, thinking, which I think has really never been resolved.
You have a couple of chapters on early feminists, Anna Wheeler and Flora Tristan, who are names that are new to me.
Right.
Tell us about them. First, Anna Wheeler.
Well, the reason I did two reasons. Number one, if you look at Bob Heilbronner's book, for example, there are no women in it. Economics has always been very sort of masculine to the extent of being misogynistic, I think. It's starting to change a bit now. So I wanted to put some women thinkers in there, just as a principle. But I also thought you can't tell the history of capitalism without women. They're half the population. So in the early Industrial Revolution, they were more than half the workforce in the factories, as I say, of Manchester, because they were more pliant, and in Massachusetts, obviously, the mills, I do mention them, the famous farm girls who left the farms in Massachusetts to go work in the mills in Lowell and places. So women were part of the labor force. They were the biggest part of the labor force then. So I wanted to include some women, and I started off with Anna Wheeler and Flora Tristan because I was trying to Marx and Engels always get all the attention when you're writing about socialism, but there was actually a pre-Marxist socialism in Britain and in France. And Anna Wheeler and Flora Tristan were associated with various aspects of that. Anna Wheeler was an Irish laird, really. An Irish aristocrat. She somehow got interested she had married a drunken Irish ne'er-do-well, and he basically ran through her money and his own money and then left. And then it became abusive, She left him, moved to England and sort of set up a salon with Jeremy Bentham and various sort of the philosophic radicals as they were known at the time. And she became involved with the other person in the early 19th century I read about, William Thompson. She was sort of his intellectual muse and was a very staunch feminist. So she was sort of the first socialist feminist, I would say, one of them. And Flora Tristan was a French who I owe my knowledge of in original sense, somebody who might be in the audience, Eva Rosenfeld, who put me on to her. And she was a remarkable woman, an author, a novelist, who then sort of devoted her life to the idea of a universal union, including men and women. All the early labour unions were men only. In Glasgow, they famously had a riot to keep the women out of the sort of artisanal unions. But she had this idea of a universal union, which men, women, everybody could join. So I thought she merited a chapter as well. So I tried to keep that thread through it. Joan Robinson's in there, Rosa Luxemburg is in there, another remarkable character, and Sylvia, more locally, Silvia Federici and the Wages for Housework movement in the 1970s. It still exists in some forms, but the most famous iteration of it was in New York, in Brooklyn, Park Slope was where they had their original shop and sort of hangout. And that, going back to this idea of women playing an essential role in capitalism, I didn't just put them in because I was trying to be a sort of, feminist. I put them in because I thought it was essential. The wages for housework critique is that capitalism has always depended on women, even when they weren't a large part of the labour force, because they reproduced the labour force. While there was a famous demonstration back at a Firestone plant by one of the early American feminists, and her show was, you guys can't run this plant without us, because where are the workers coming from? The women, domestic labour, unpaid labour, has always been an important part of, supportive role. Social reproduction, Silvia Federici called it, to use the technical phrase. And so there's a chapter on that too. Sorry, long answer to a short question.
Here's a critique out of left field, right field, I don't know which. As I was putting together my notes, I got by my email the review from Compact magazine. And there's a striking sentence in there: Roram Novarum is never mentioned, an omission that, for obvious reasons, suddenly feels more jolting. And those of you who are not up in your Catholic history, Roram Novarum was the encyclical issued by Pope Leo XIII on this day in 1891. It's an anniversary day. And Leo XIV, the new pope, took his name in honor of the 13th. But there is this Catholic social teaching that is a critique of capitalism. Did you think of including that?
I did. I made a big error. I thought of including Leo XIII as a sort of critic of the late 19th century, because the encyclical is an amazing document if you go read it. It's an indictment of industrial capitalism. But it didn't really fit in with the sort of narrative structure of the book. There are a few people who you think, why aren't they in there? And he's certainly one of them. Because it was an amazing thing. There is some Christian socialism in there. I mean, I guess I sort of come out of that tradition to some extent. There's certainly some sort of influence of G.D.H. Cole in some of this stuff. Marxist socialism is not the only socialism. There was as I said, Polanyi regarded himself as a Christian socialist too. I'm a lapsed Christian socialist. A lapsed Catholic socialist, sorry.
All right, I should probably do another couple of questions so we can turn to the audience. Is AI going to wreck everything?
That's mine. Well, maybe your next book, Doug, or mine. Who am I to say what AI is going to do? I'm not an expert in the technology. I will say that I've been reporting on the sort of economic side of it for a few years now. And if you go speak to the people who are experts in it, both the technologists and the economists who study this stuff, I think the conventional wisdom has shifted. I think 5 years ago, the economists certainly were relatively optimistic. They thought that AI could sort of complement labor, make workers more productive, not just factory workers, but you think of a doctor with the AI model helping them to make diagnosis, or radiologists or whatever. That's a classic example. Or a university lecturer using AI to help him help her produce the lectures. But now, when you go talk to them, I spoke to some people at MIT and Harvard and Stanford for a piece I wrote on this, an adaptation I did the book for the New Yorker a few weeks ago. It's a lot darker view. Because of the sort of great rush, profit-driven rush, the way we're seeing since OpenAI, turned into a profit-making concern and sold a stake to Microsoft. There's basically just a huge arms race between the various AI companies, and it looks like they're just going to rush out as much as they can in terms of displacing labor, rather than there's no restraints on it. So there may be models where you don't have any. Maybe you still need a surgeon, but do you really need a doctor to diagnose something if the AI program can do it better? Do you need a teacher? I mean, we're seeing it already. Kids in school, they all use it. I have a daughter in Princeton who tells me that even the Ivy League now, kids are using AI in exams. The idea, you get a take-home exam, they all just feed it into the AI programs. So I think, what's the point of sending your kid to university and paying like gazillion dollars a year if they're just going to use AI? So I think, that's just one place. In the sort of cognitive, educated part of the economy, which we've largely been oblivious to not oblivious, but we've benefited from it until recently. I think AI is going to, change the equation. How it's going to change it, I can see an optimistic scenario in which it sort of radicalizes the white-collar worker, and they realize they have to sort of stick together or they're going to be displaced. And I can see a very dystopian outcome too, where it's just Elon Musk and a few others running basically everything.
Maybe it's time to reincarnate Ned Ludd.
Yeah, no, I mean, as I said, I have more sympathy for the Luddites than I used to have. I think, someone asked me the other night, they said, but if you want to be a Luddite now, what would you do?
Smash server farms.
Exactly, that's what I thought. I would imagine they've got pretty heavy security, though.
I would imagine so. Towards the end, you toy with the idea of yoking Joe Stiglitz and Silvia Federici and the paleos of national conservatism into some sort of coalition to rein in capitalism. Is that just a momentary fantasy you're playing with, or you think there's something there?
Well, I mean, it is obviously a fantasy at the moment. I mean, if you don't, I don't see what the alternative. There has to be some alternative to sort of the Trumpian economic nationalism, authoritarian model, which is sort of, in political terms, and not in economic terms, but in political terms, is sort of sweeping all before it right at the moment. You just have to look what's happening in Germany and France and even the UK. The most popular party in the UK now is not the Conservative Party or the Labour Party, it's the Reform Party, which is a sort of Trump wannabe party, led by Nigel Farage, who's an even bigger shyster than Trump. So, what you can either say, okay, let's burn the system down and replace it completely, which I think, that's in its modern incarnation, I think it's not associated with sort of state socialism anymore and state planning, Gosplan type stuff. I think that's more associated with the sort of radical degrowth movement, which I do have 2 chapters on. Maybe I'm too moderate. I don't see that as I think, the shift towards sustainable, we have to obviously address climate change and there going to need to be some radical changes, but to go completely down that path and sort of tell developing countries as well that they can't grow fast, I think is, probably not a practical solution. So coming out of a sort of centre-left Keynesian social democratic tradition, I and everybody else in that tradition, is basically looking around for what is the 21st century form of a sort of Keynesian social compact. And now, if there was a simple answer to that question, the Labour Party wouldn't be at 20% in the opinion polls after, 6 months in office. The Democratic Party wouldn't be, split asunder, and the French Socialists and the German SPD wouldn't be sort of, heading down the toilet hole of history. But I do think it is, it's the great question. And in the last chapter, I have some suggestions based on the work of Stiglitz and various others, Danny Roderick, Suresh Naidu up at Columbia, people I would call, centre-leftist, but centre-left rather than radical left. And we know some aspects of it. People say, oh, Keynesianism's failed, it's a disaster. I don't think that's true. We know some aspects of a system which would be more human. I call it managed capitalism, which people say, oh, you're just that's just an apologia, which I guess to some extent it is. But I think we know some aspects of it which do work. If you full employment, for 30 years after sort of 1975, actually 40 years, there was basically wage stagnation in this country. Why was that? Well, in the 70s, was an economic crisis, and then after that, we basically gave up on full employment. The sort of Milton Friedman's view of the world took over, and full employment became to be defined as 6% unemployment rather than 2% or 3% unemployment. If you run the economy with 6% unemployment, you go back to Marx's reserve army. Workers have got no bargaining power. Wages stagnate. Productivity goes up higher than wages. You get rising inequality. That's exactly what we've got. And from about 2015-16 onward, the Fed, to give it its due, has been running the economy to try and reduce unemployment as far as it can go. We got down to the 4s and the 3s with low inflation. And lo and behold, what happened? Workers' wages started going up, especially at the bottom of the distribution. There's been actually a narrowing of wage inequality in the last 10 years because people at the bottom have sort of started to catch up a bit with people in the middle. Still massive sort of disassociation at the top. So it's not I'm not saying it's a panacea, but full employment is one aspect. Social safety net, the sort of Bernie, Elizabeth Warren agenda, I think, has got a lot to be said for it. And people say, Trump says they're Marxist socialists. That's bullshit. They're European social democrats. They believe in, a right to education, a right to healthcare. That's basically what the European model did offer for 30 or 40 years. So how do you reconstruct that model? And then we do need, the other aspect which does, of course, need to be addressed is how do you fit in the addressing climate change part of it? Biden gets zero credit for it. He did start to sort of provide incentives, big incentives for green energy. It wasn't everything, but it was a lot more than had been done before. So you can see the sort of basic elements of a sort of new Keynesianism, whatever you want to call it, but it's not. I don't think it's the economics and the sort of policy side of it, which is that difficult. It's the political economy side of it. Nobody has managed to sell it to the masses. And if you think about that, it goes back to the workers really, and to the sort of class divide. Where did the Keynesian model come from? It came from the labor movement in the 20th century. There wouldn't have been Keynesian social democracy after the Second World War without a very strong labor movement. There wouldn't have been the New Deal and the sort of Treaty of Detroit after the Second World War. That was all based on a social compact between labor and capital. Now, certainly a large part in the US and the UK, a large part of the white working class is, in the right-wing populist camp. And, the most alarming thing under Trump was, in the last election, it seemed like a lot of members of the minority working class as well in the US were shifting in that direction, certainly Hispanic working class voters. That's an alarm bell for the Democratic Party. So how do you construct a sort of new social bargain when the workers aren't with you? I think is a very, very difficult question to answer, and that's why I say the people who trash all the centre-left parties I say to them, yeah, they're not great, I totally agree, but, what's your solution? And I haven't really heard a convincing one.
You anticipated my last question, which was going to be where you're coming from, but just a little political coda here. That kind of center-left compromise you're talking about, it's hard to imagine that would be possible without a really seriously radical movement to which that could seem like a sober alternative. We had a Soviet Union, which was a very substantial rival for the U.S., which had an effect on Western capitalism. Can that sort of thing that you're talking about happen without a bunch of frothers pushing the envelope?
No, you need a popular movement. I totally agree. The question is how you construct it. You need. I mean, one of the people who's not in the book probably should be in there. Is John Kenneth Galbraith, who had the theory of countervailing power. Sure, the forces of the capital force, to get crude about it, the forces of capitalism had their own way for 30, 40 years, and of course they're not going to give in unless they're frightened. And I'm not talking in terms of necessarily violence, but they're frightened of very, very high taxes, basically an attack on all their prerogatives, very, very strong antitrust. A sort of financial repression of the sort that we had after the Second World War, which actually worked pretty well. When they think the only way you're going to get that sort of agenda is with a sort of mass movement and getting people to the polls, or mass demonstrations. I mean, under Trump, it may come to the fact of, I was speaking to a politician who shall stay unnamed in Washington a couple of weeks ago, and she said, we're getting to sort of general strike type scenarios. So, no, you need mass movement, but how do you build a mass movement, Doug, when you don't have the labor movement? When you don't have, now, there are environmental movements, there are, obviously, there've been some, strenuous efforts to unionize the sort of service sector of the economy. One of the things Biden was trying to do was to sort of strengthen the care economy. He never got anywhere. That was the part of the Build Back Better agenda which got cut out. So, the ideas are there. It's how do you mobilize people? Maybe I ask you, how do you do it?
Not me. I wish I knew. Yeah. All right. I think we should turn to some audience questions. You want to pick your interlocutors?
Sure, yeah. Anybody got any questions, please? Anything. And if you want critical questions, shoot away. Yes, the lady at the front.
It's so refreshing to hear you, talking about center-left and what Biden, tried to do, because the Democratic Party eating themselves alive, like that they did, that they didn't look out for people and being condemned, yet the populist notions, the cultural elements of this became so overwhelming that look what happened. But I think your analysis and your appreciation of that center-left it's so important and so refreshing to hear it, because there's been, I think, a tremendous amount of self-deprecation among people who did try to do things during that administration. And now it's as though that was all, somehow not for the workers or not for people. It's crazy, but anyway.
Well,
I appreciate hearing you so much.
Oh, thanks. Well, I don't want to, sound like an apologist for Biden. I don't think he did everything, but I don't think he was as black as he's painted now either. I think on the sort of culture wars versus economics, I think it was a bit of both, obviously. I think inflation was what really killed the Biden administration, just as it killed the Carter administration in the 1970s. It's always been a bit of a mystery why inflation is such a government killer, but it just is. Ask the Conservatives in England or the centre-right in Germany. It's not sort of a right-left thing. They've just both been decimated in elections too because of the post-pandemic inflation. But yeah, I'm not saying, I don't have a centre-left, recipe. Maybe somebody said you should write that in the next book. Take me another 10 years. But what I'm saying is that's where the agenda, the centre-left's in crisis. It is, because it hasn't got that agenda. But, it's still well-meaning. And, when they did try and do something at least. I mean, my critique of if I wanted to critique the Biden administration, I'd say they only sort of pivoted towards the sort of wealth tax, Elizabeth Warren, take on Wall Street aspect when they'd already sort of lost the Congress, and they knew they couldn't do it. So there was some cynicism there, I think. Yes, next gentleman at the front. Oh, sorry, yes.
Oh, I guess I have my...
No, no, you were first. Sorry, I just didn't see.
My name is Oluwakemi, and I'm looking forward to reading your book. One quick comment, if I may. Maybe a possible mass movement is among tenants, if it's not too embedded in the American psyche of home ownership.
Yeah.
But my question is actually more so related to like this being a history of ideas. I feel like currently it feels like the kind of popular political philosophy, it's like either, maybe like Thomas Piketty broke through, but it's mostly kind of like, techno-libertarian and I don't know, like stoic tech bros. And I'm curious, just kind of looking at these different periods of history, if there have been eras where it felt like conversations about philosophy were more embedded in the public sphere, and if you kind of compare it to today, why you would say that we don't have that same kind of rigor of ideas.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. What's the role of ideas and sort of intellectuals in history? I mean, there's two sort of divergent views on that. One is the sort of famous quote from Keynes that, economic ideas rule everything, and that even the sort of obscure, the most obscure sort of despot is basically the slave of some defunct economists from years ago. So that basically ideas rule the world. I don't agree with that. I mean, I think ideas are important, but I'm more of a materialist than that. I think economics sort of basically rules the world. I find myself agreeing with sort of Milton Friedman of all people. I once interviewed Friedman like 30 years ago for a piece about the state of economics. And I asked him, what's the question you just asked really, what's the role of ideas? When do they, are there points where they become more important or less important? And his answer was that the role of sort of ideologues or economists, theorists, is to keep the ideas alive until the sort of political circumstances coalesce that you can sort of, do something with them. And I think that is true. It's a sort of more sophisticated version of the, the argument that never let a crisis go to waste. The problem is, obviously, we've had two enormous crises. We've had the global financial crisis of 2007, 2009, and then the pandemic, both of which produced sort of, remedial policies, but certainly didn't produce the sort of great epochal changes that the Great Depression produced in the 1930s. You would have expected, I would have expected, if basically global capitalism almost collapses in upon itself as it did in 2008, that, there'd be more, it would create a sort of bigger opportunity to, for reform. Now, the Marxists here, if there are some, will say, that was, who are you kidding? This capitalists still control the commanding heights of the economy and they control the media, etc. That was never going to happen. But I think democracy, in certain circumstances, can sort of overcome the interests. But it is only at certain points. And we don't seem to be at that point right now, I agree. I mean, it looked like 10 years ago when I sort of started out on this project, there were sort of opinion polls showing that among young Americans, socialism was more popular than capitalism. That was one of the reasons I wrote the book, actually, because I thought, oh, well, at least there's a market for it. Things haven't gone as hoped. That doesn't mean one of I try to be hopeful. One of the hopeful things about the book is that nothing's forever. Things happen in cycles. Polanyi in the 1930s thought fascism was going to win. And 10 years later, the social democracy, it's triumphed. Now, in the interim, there was, an absolute terrible catastrophe, so we don't want that to happen. But there is, you know, as I said, I am a sort of Keynesian social democrat. I believe the system can be reformed. It's just, but the challenges are huge. Sorry, Jen. No, I think the thing's coming.
Speaking of Milton Friedman, he gave a talk, everybody has forgotten now apparently, in Stockholm in 1954, saying essentially, and this is a fairly narrow question compared to your book, that a Great Depression of 1930s severity was essentially impossible by that point, mostly because of deposit insurance, a few other things got off the gold standard and so forth. I wonder if that's still a valid way to think about the possibility of a depression, or has the economy and financial markets evolved to such an extent that that's no longer so important?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the presence of what economists call automatic stabilizers has certainly made the economy more stable. That's what they're there for. Fiscal and monetary policy. You know, when you have when you go into recession, unemployment benefits go up. It provides some demand. That's a sort of Keynesian stimulus in disguise to the economy. You've got monetary policy. I think modern capitalism is, you know, like that with a financial system. You can't separate the sort of industrial structure. I've got a chapter on Veblen, who we haven't mentioned, who sort of divided capitalists into industrialists, who he really liked, the sort of engineers, the guys who were on the shop floor, you know, churning stuff out, and the pecuniary capitalists, the financiers and the sort of robber barons, who he hated. The problem, one of the problems in it now, is that the thing, you know, it's so intertwined. So you think in a Marx, if I'm like Marx and Engles in 1857, I'm thinking that's great, you know, because it's going to make the crises even bigger and next financial collapse. They thought the 1857 collapse would, you know, bring everything down. But they, if you think financial sector getting bigger and bigger, surely that's going to bring bigger crises. Capitalism is going to collapse. Yes, up to a point. You've also got the central bank, and it turns out, you know, if you've got a central bank which can print money and bail out everybody in the crisis, that's a very powerful, sort of tool to save capitalism, and that's what saved it in 2007, 2009. Federal Reserve basically guaranteed the entire financial system. I mean, there was a moment in 2008, 2009, one of the Fed program was guaranteeing corporate debt. So, you know, it wasn't just guaranteeing federal debt. It was guaranteeing General Motors debt and everybody else. You could go to the government and issue your debt under that program, and if you then went belly up, the taxpayer would pay for it. That was socialism in action. So basically, socialism saved capitalism in 2007 to 2009. And I thought at the time, this is going to produce a massive backlash, and, you know, it's an opportunity for the left. It turned out it produced an opportunity for the right. You know, now there's huge debates about why that was, but.
Funny thing that the Federal Reserve and the Treasury both made money on the bailout.
And they made money in the end, yeah, in the bailout. But, you know, I mean, so yeah, it's. If the Fed steps aside, then capitalism will, you know, we will be back to the Great Depression. Anybody else? Anything?
Where does the military-industrial complex and imperialism factor into this? Because I feel in this country, it's a force separate and apart from traditional capitalism. We seem to use that as a hammer to try to enforce capitalism around the world.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. There are a couple of big themes in the book which we haven't really touched on tonight. One of them is race, and the other one is the sort of imperialism, military-industrial complex. I mean, you know, I'm not going to sit here and give you a sort of two-sentence, you know, synopsis of my views on how essential imperialism is to capitalism. That debate has been, but I will say in this book, there are 3 or 4 chapters on the critics who make the argument that it's essential, starting with John Hobson, the British liberal of the late 19th century, who went to South Africa and saw the Boer War, etc., and wrote a book called Imperialism, which formed the basis of Lenin's imperialism, the higher stage of capitalism. So there's always been a left-wing argument that capitalism is an expansionary system, and eventually it outgrows its homeland. There's not enough. Back in the day, people used to worry about overproduction. Who's going to buy all the stuff in the factories? The workers can't do it because their wages aren't high enough. The capitalists won't do it because they don't need all that stuff that they're going to save. You're going to run into an overproduction crisis. That was the phrase they used in the late 19th century. Hobson and then also Rosa Luxemburg, from a more Marxian perspective, made the argument that the outlet is imperialism. You go abroad, you create markets, and that props up. It's not just sort of race-driven imperialism. It's an economic necessity to go out there and conquer lands and create new markets. So that's always been a very powerful critique. Now you get into this post-Second World War period, and then that argument gets resurrected in the form of the military-industrial complex. And the chapter I'd point you towards that in the book is Joan Robinson, who basically was a critic of military. She was a Keynesian. She was one of Keynes' students. So she, in theoretical terms, and she wrote a book on Marx, and she admired Marx, but she thought the labor theory of value was sort of metaphysics. So she was never a sort of Marxist in the economic sense of the word. But she was pretty left-wing, and she was sort of left Keynesian. And she thought the sort of original idea of Keynesianism based on sort of social democracy and social programs had been corrupted into this military-industrial complex, and especially in the US, we had sort of military Keynesianism. And there's something in that. If you just look at the figures for military spending in the 1950s and 1960s, it goes up a hell of a lot. It goes up a lot in the 50s, obviously because of the Korean War and the start of the Cold War, and then it goes up to sort of 10-12% of GDP in the Vietnam War. So yeah, there's always been a prop there from military spending. Could capitalism survive without that? We've never really tested that proposition.
We have time for one more question here.
Actually, just dovetailing on that very good question, I would like to know more about your views on the Chinese version of capitalism, especially with this angle of imperialism, that you need to expand, you need to invade, and the Chinese, their idea is being the tributary, that you don't have to go and invade, everybody will come to you. Is their capitalism could expand without imperialism in the same version that we've seen from the Western?
It depends who you talk to, right? I mean, if you go and speak to people at the State Department, they would say the Chinese are very imperialistic. They're just using economic imperialism as the tool. I mean, I think it is alarming in that what do I think of Chinese state capitalism? I think it's been a hell of a lot more successful than anybody thought. And it's been, a million times more successful than the sort of Ivy League shock therapy which they gave to the Russians. So the Chinese saw that and said, we don't want any part of that. The great Chinese, I think Deng Xiaoping was, he was the great genius. And I don't think he knew any economics at all, but he was very practical, and his sort of, his metaphor of stepping on stones as you cross the river, I think that's what's motivated them, and they do what they think works. So I think, instead of dismantling the state sector, they just left it. There are still big state-owned companies in China. All the locally owned enterprises, they still exist, most of them. But they said all the rest of the economy, the new growth economy, that's going to be capitalistic. So they've got I wouldn't call it a dual economy. They've got a double economy there really, and it has been incredibly successful. Now people think some people would argue it's starting to run into its sort of constraints. They have an aging population, but I think it's as a model of capitalism, it's been very successful, and it's one of the models out there which they're trying to sell to other countries. And if you put it next to Trumpian economic nationalism, it looks pretty good, which is why Lula was just in China last week. Now, but it brings back. I mean, I think the rise of China does bring back to sort of imperialism. I don't want to sound like Graham Allison of Harvard, the sort of Thucydides trap, but it does look, dangerously like the pre-1914, where you have the sort of rival industrial powers, starting to sort of grapple with each other. So I'm not massively optimistic that we're going to manage that, because the US, I think it is an imperialistic enough country that it doesn't like somebody, emerging as the top dog. There's always this debate: are we containing China, or are we, dealing with them? And I think the Chinese now think the Americans are containing them, and I think they are. They're going to try anyway. So I think that's quite alarming.
Great. Doug, do you have another final?
Sorry, there must be something more upbeat about that, right, at the end? I know. Anyway, I guess there's no more questions. Thanks, everybody, coming. I said, thanks very much to Doug for agreeing to it, and being such a excellent interlocutor. And thank you all for coming. And if anybody actually wants to buy the book or sign it, this is a capitalistic enterprise, so I'll be sitting at the back of the room signing.